Hi, my name is Tobias Gross, and I've recently written a research paper investigating whether the federal government should provide financial incentives for renewable energy. So, I've almost completed my project, and I'd like to share a few conclusions that I found. And as the title of this video suggests, I'd also like to talk about the policy of tax shifting, which I'll get back to later. Now, the primary argument made by proponents of incentives for renewable energy is that they will encourage the development of renewable energy and that this is necessary in order to address the problem of climate change. So this is their number one reason, is preventing climate change, fighting climate change. Now, opponents, on the other hand, argue that incentives are actually a waste of money. They argue that incentives for renewable energy will result in the misallocation of resources, that they are not efficient from an economic standpoint, that they fly in the face of free market values, and that they're going to be an undue burden, an unreasonable burden on taxpayers. So, these two sides, they almost tend to demonize each other in the sense that those who are for renewable energy, they sometimes argue that their opponents are really just climate deniers, that they either don't believe in climate change, or if they do believe and understand what's actually going on with climate change, that they just don't care, that all they care about is short-term profits. So, on the other hand, those who are against incentives for alternative energy, some of them, they don't believe that it actually has anything to do with fighting climate change. Some of them believe that these incentives are actually just, the renewable energy industry trying to get a leg up at the expense of taxpayers in this kind of corrupt alliance between government and special interests. So, both of these characterizations are dramatized, but they both actually have a hint of truth to them. So, for example, incentives really do pose a risk to taxpayers, and they pass costs on to them. And the most striking example of this has been the now infamous case of Solyndra, which was a solar manufacturer which received about $535 million in loan guarantees from the federal government. And in September of 2011, they ended up filing for bankruptcy. So, on the other hand, though, if you're going to say that incentives are bad and that we can't have them, but you're not going to offer another solution, then you're simply not addressing the problem of climate change. So, where do we go from here? So, in my opinion, the concerns regarding incentives are large enough to say, hey, maybe we should take a step back. Maybe we should look for alternatives. On the other hand, climate change is not up for dispute anymore. This is not the 1980s. It's 2012. Frankly, there is international scientific consensus that climate change is occurring, that it is man-made, that it is caused by increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases like CO2, which are entering the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels, and that climate change is going to have significant environmental, economic, ecological, and social costs related to it. So, how do we approach this problem? My preferred solution is a policy known as tax shifting. So, what tax shifting seeks to do is to create a marketplace which is honest, a marketplace which reflects the true costs of socially and environmentally destructive processes, like the emitting of carbon dioxide. So the cost of rising sea levels, the cost of increasing likelihood of drought, loss of biodiversity, and a whole host of other threats to human well-being, those costs, they are difficult to quantify, but they are real. And our market system is totally ignoring those costs right now. So how do you incorporate these costs in? And the way you do this is to figure out, to the best of our ability, what those costs are likely to be, and then add that cost onto the established costs of what you would do anyway. So add it to the destructive process that you're trying to discourage, like burning fossil fuels. So you add a tax on carbon dioxide. So, at this point, some of you might be thinking, hey, like a carbon tax. I've already heard about this argument. I don't want to pay more for energy, and it's going to be terrible for the economy. But hear me out. So, if you tax something which is destructive, you're still going to raise revenue, and hopefully, over the long run, this tax will discourage fossil fuels and encourage gains in efficiency, and you'll inevitably have decreasing revenues from that tax source as people adapt. However, in the meantime, that revenue that you're raising will free up the burden to tax other things. For example, income. So income is not something you want to be discouraging. Income is not something you want to be taxing because you are going to discourage people from working. By the same argument, if you tax home ownership, you are discouraging people from, buying homes. If you're going to tax capital gains, you're going to discourage people from investing. So, if we're going to have to tax something, why not tax something which we can agree upon is destructive? Why not tax something that we can agree upon should be discouraged? So, furthermore, I'd like to argue that, or present that these policies are widely endorsed by professional economists. And that includes 9 Nobel Prize-winning economists who've endorsed the idea of tax shifting, and 2,500 overall, including Harvard economics professor and the chairman of President George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, Gregory Mankiw. And he proposed a similar tax on gasoline, which would be coordinated with a reduction in the income tax, the payroll tax, sorry. Now, this policy is also the one advocated by Lester Brown, who is the director of the Earth Policy Institute and who happens to be the author of Plan B, which I would absolutely recommend to anyone interested in environmental sustainability. So, to get back on topic, enacting the carbon tax would be simple. It may not be the easiest idea to stomach on first impression, but it's probably the most straightforward solution we have available. And I think the main barrier to getting this implemented is political feasibility. So this is a problem because the carbon tax, the idea of it, hasn't been very popular. And there will be pushback from the traditional energy industry and from many regular people who are concerned about rising energy prices. And I'll get back to that because that is a problem, and I'm going to address that. But once you understand the issues, it becomes apparent that what this is really about is a question of priorities. And that question is, do you value economic growth in the traditional sense, in monetary terms, in the near future, what is convenient for you today, or do you value what is best for society in the long run? Do you value preventing harm to future generations, harm to people in developing countries who are less able to adapt to the consequences of climate change, and pushing these costs, whether they be monetary, ecological, societal, economic, pushing those costs off onto other people somewhere else, somewhere in the future, in some other country, and eventually climate change will affect everyone, even the wealthy, even people in America, even people who, can afford to adapt to some degree. And these consequences and that the moral ideas that you're pushing these costs onto other people, I think that is the main reason why a tax on carbon is absolutely necessary. So, again, the only thing that's standing in the way of it, I think, is the political will to do it. And again, one of the biggest criticisms I hear from this idea, about this idea, is that raising energy prices on working class people is unfair, and it'll be bad for the economy. And this is why I want to emphasize the positive benefits of this policy, and that is that these taxes will raise revenue that will allow us to reduce taxes on income, like the payroll tax. And the payroll tax is currently a regressive tax on working and middle class people. So, having recognized that you can lower the payroll tax on working class people, I think there would be some political support for this. There might be some feasibility after all. So, I want a policymaker to come up with a bill that says, hey, we're going to increase the tax on carbon, we're going to create a carbon tax, but we're going to reduce the payroll tax. So, excuse me. So, if you'd like to know more about this topic, I've included several links in the description box on YouTube. And otherwise, you can actually visit my website, fixthiscountry.org, and all the links are there as well. And for example, one of the links I have is a link to an article by economist Paul Krugman, and that's regarding the 2,500 economists who support the idea of tax shifting. And you can also find a link to Lester Brown's book, Plan B, where you can get it completely for free in a digital version, legally. So there you go. On one last note, I would like to encourage you to become involved. And that may mean writing a letter to your congressman, or it may mean simply talking about this issue with your friends and raising awareness about this idea. So, that concludes my presentation, and I'd like to thank you for watching.